Thanks for joining us. A Warner Robins man says his wife committed suicide, but now he's accused of killing her. Brian McManus is charged with malice murder of his wife, Lucille Anne McManus. Fariha Abra talked to police about how evidence turned a suspicious death into a murder case.
That's right, Lori. Investigators say Brian McManus called 911 Friday morning. He told them he'd just returned home from walking his dog when he found his wife, who he said shot and killed herself. But investigators say the evidence does not back him up, and that includes interviews with McManus's own neighbors. Around 9 a.m., 55-year-old Brian McManus called police to say he found his wife dead.
His wife, Miss McManus, had committed suicide, or so he thought.
A woman's skull was shattered with a rubber mallet. Her neck was crushed by bare hands. And the man who destroyed her was the same man she'd invited into her bed, into her home, into her heart just 3 months after swiping right on a dating app. He beat her so viciously that blood sprayed across the walls and ceiling. Then he walked his dog, tossed the murder weapon into a ditch, and calmly called 911 to report a suicide. But there was no gun. There were no bullets, only brutal, calculated murder. This is the story of how a trusting grandmother became the target of a predator hiding behind a charming smile and a fake British accent. Welcome to Cold Crime Cases. Before we dive into one of the most chilling cases of betrayal and murder Georgia has ever witnessed, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a case. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether you're tuning in from Atlanta, London, or halfway across the world. I want to hear from you. Your engagement keeps this channel alive and helps us bring you the darkest, most compelling true crime stories every single week. Now, let's get into this nightmare. November 24th, 2023, the day after Thanksgiving. Most families in Warner Robins, Georgia, were still savoring leftovers, still basking in the warmth of holiday togetherness. But at 202 Wake Forest Drive, something unspeakable had just occurred. At exactly 9:10 inches the morning, a man with a British accent called 911. His voice was unnervingly steady, almost robotic, as he reported what he claimed was a tragic discovery. "I've just returned from walking my dog," he said, his tone devoid of panic or grief. "My wife is dead. It appears to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound." The caller was 57-year-old Brian McManus, and within hours, investigators would realize that every single word coming out of his mouth was a carefully rehearsed lie. When Detective Carmen Thompson and Detective Elizabeth Smith arrived at the modest home on Wake Forest Drive, they found Brian standing in the front yard, casually waiting, not pacing, not crying, not visibly shaken, just waiting, as if he'd been expecting them, as if this were all part of some script he'd written in his mind. "My wife shot herself," he repeated calmly when the detectives approached. "I found her when I came back from my walk, but the moment those detectives stepped inside that house, they knew. Something was horrifically, undeniably wrong. The woman they found wasn't lying peacefully in bed. She wasn't holding a gun. In fact, there was no gun anywhere to be found. What they discovered instead was a scene of such savage, unrelenting violence that even seasoned investigators were shaken. 63-year-old Lucille Anne McManus, known affectionately as Miss Anne to everyone who loved her, lay naked across her bed. Her head had been caved in with such brutal force that blood had splattered across the walls, pooling on the floor, streaking the ceiling above. The injuries to her skull were catastrophic. This wasn't suicide. This was slaughter. And the man who reported it? The man standing calmly in the front yard? He was about to become the prime suspect in one of the most cold-blooded, calculated murders Georgia had seen in years. But before we understand how Miss Anne ended up in that blood-soaked bedroom, we need to understand who she was. Because this wasn't just another murder. This was the systematic destruction of a woman whose only crime was believing in love one more time. Everyone in the quiet community of Warner Robins knew Miss Anne. She was the kind of woman who made a neighborhood feel like home. The kind who remembered your birthday, waved enthusiastically from her garden when you drove past, and always had a smile that could light up the darkest day. At 63, she had weathered her share of heartbreak. She'd been widowed years earlier, losing the man she'd spent decades building a life with. But Miss Anne wasn't the type to let grief swallow her whole. She was a matriarch, a grandmother, a great-grandmother. Her home on Wake Forest Drive wasn't just hers, it was a multi-generational haven where laughter echoed through the halls, where her granddaughter Jessica Terrell and two precious great-grandchildren filled every corner with life and noise and love. But despite the fullness of her days, despite the joy her family brought her, there was a quiet loneliness that crept in during the still moments. When the house went silent at night, when she sat alone with her morning coffee, when she realized that companionship, the kind she'd once shared with her late husband, was something she desperately missed. Miss Anne wasn't naive. She wasn't foolish. She was simply human. And like millions of people her age, she decided to take a chance on finding love again. In 2022, at 61 years old, she did what so many do in the modern world. She created a profile on Tinder, uploaded a few photos, and cautiously began exploring the possibility of connection. She had no way of knowing that this decision, this innocent, hopeful decision, would lead directly to her brutal murder. Somewhere across the Atlantic, a predator was watching, waiting, hunting. Brian McManus wasn't looking for love when he swiped through profiles on Tinder. He was looking for opportunity. At 55 years old, he presented himself online as a distinguished gentleman with an impressive background. A former officer with the London Metropolitan Police, a man of honor and integrity who'd served for 17 years protecting the citizens of one of the world's greatest cities. But what Brian conveniently left out of his carefully crafted profile was why his law enforcement career had ended. He didn't mention that he'd been dismissed in disgrace after multiple women came forward with complaints that he made them feel sexually threatened. He didn't mention the serious allegations that had destroyed his reputation and ended his career. He didn't mention any of the darkness lurking beneath his charming exterior. Instead, he built a persona designed to appeal to exactly the kind of woman Miss Anne was: someone seeking stability, respect, genuine affection, someone vulnerable, someone trusting, someone he could exploit. Their online conversations started innocently enough. Flirtations turned into phone calls turned into video chats, and Brian, ever the skilled manipulator, knew exactly what to say. He spoke of wanting a fresh start in America, of looking for someone special to build a meaningful life with, of being tired of loneliness and ready for real commitment. Miss Anne, hopeful and trusting, began to believe she'd found something rare. Here was this worldly, sophisticated British man who seemed to adore her, who wanted to be with her, who represented everything she'd been hoping to find. What she didn't know, what Brian made absolutely certain she would never discover, was that this wasn't his first attempt at using marriage for immigration purposes. He had a history, a dark, disturbing history of using women and discarding them like trash when they were no longer useful. If stories like this make you want to protect the innocent and expose the truth, then don't just watch. Subscribe. That single click could be the reason another story finally gets heard. Brian had previously been married to a woman in Idaho. That relationship had ended in divorce after he was arrested for domestic violence. The pattern was already established. Find a vulnerable woman, exploit her trust, use her for what you need, and move on when the situation no longer serves you. But Miss Anne knew none of this. All she knew was that this charming British gentleman was sweeping her off her feet. The courtship moved with alarming speed. Within just 3 months of matching on Tinder, 3 months, Brian proposed marriage. For a woman who had perhaps resigned herself to spending her remaining years alone, it felt like destiny, like fate, like the universe was giving her one final chance at happiness. In 2022, they were married. Brian packed his life into suitcases and moved into the family home on Wake Forest Drive, instantly becoming part of a bustling household that included not just Miss Anne, but Jessica, the great-grandchildren, and all the chaos and joy that comes with a multi-generational home. From the outside, it might have looked like a beautiful blended family finding their rhythm. But those closest to Miss Anne noticed something off from the very beginning. Multiple witnesses would later testify that the marriage seemed specifically designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to secure Brian's green card and permanent residency in the United States. The timing was suspicious. The speed was suspicious. And Brian's behavior after the paperwork was filed? That was the most suspicious of all. Once Brian had what he needed, once his immigration status was secured and his path to permanent residency seemed clear, his mask began to slip. The charming British gentleman who had wooed Miss Anne with poetry and promises started revealing his true nature. And it was something dark, something calculating, something monstrous. Brian began taking frequent trips to Florida. He would pack a bag, kiss Miss Anne goodbye, and disappear for days at a time, offering only vague explanations about business meetings and work opportunities that required his presence out of state. But Brian wasn't in Florida for business. He was there visiting his mistress. The woman he was secretly involved with was also married, making their affair a double betrayal that demonstrated Brian's complete lack of regard for marriage, commitment, or the feelings of anyone but himself. For months, he maintained this elaborate deception with the same cold calculation that had defined every other aspect of his relationship with Miss Anne. He would return from these trips, slip back into the role of devoted husband, sit down for family dinners, play the part of a man committed to building a life with her. But it was all performance, all lies, all manipulation. Jessica Terrell would later recall that Brian seemed increasingly uncomfortable at family gatherings during this time. He would withdraw from conversations, appearing agitated when expected to engage naturally with the family he'd supposedly joined. There was something unsettling about his presence, though no one could have predicted the true extent of his deception or the danger he represented. District Attorney Eric Edwards would eventually describe Brian as a serial liar and conman who viewed women as nothing more than disposable objects to be used and discarded at will. A narcissist who genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any room. A predator who felt entitled to take whatever he wanted. Consequences be damned. And in November 2023, Brian made a mistake. A careless, arrogant mistake that would set in motion the events leading to Miss Anne's brutal murder. In what can only be described as a moment of stunning carelessness, Brian accidentally sent Miss Anne a text message that had been intended for his mistress in Florida. The message was intimate, affectionate, and it made absolutely clear that Brian was involved in a serious romantic relationship with another woman. For Miss Anne, receiving that text must have felt like the world collapsing around her. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart and her home, was not only having an affair, he was deeply involved with someone else. The entire relationship had been a lie. But Miss Anne was not a woman to suffer betrayal in silence. She confronted Brian, and the confrontation was explosive. She demanded answers. She expressed the pain and rage that any betrayed spouse would feel. And in her anger and heartbreak, she made a decision that would seal her fate. She told Brian she was going to report their marriage to immigration authorities as fraud. She threatened to expose the sham their entire relationship had been built upon. Imagine if it was your daughter, your sister, or your friend. Would you want their story buried under noise or told with care? Subscribing helps make sure no child's story fades away. Not ready to subscribe? That's okay. But at least tell me why in the comments. I want to learn from you. For Brian, this threat represented absolute catastrophe. If Miss Anne followed through, he would be immediately deported back to the United Kingdom, back to the country where his law enforcement career had ended in disgrace, back to the place where everyone knew what he really was. His green card, the entire reason he'd married Miss Anne in the first place, would be revoked. His carefully constructed American life would crumble. But rather than face the consequences of his actions, rather than accept responsibility for the web of lies he'd woven, Brian began contemplating something unthinkable. In his twisted mind, the problem wasn't his behavior. The problem wasn't the fraud he'd committed or the woman he'd betrayed. The problem was Miss Anne herself. She had become inconvenient, a threat, an obstacle. And in Brian McManus's worldview, inconvenient women were disposable. So he began planning her murder. The morning of November 24th, 2023, began like any other morning in the McManus household. Miss Anne went through her usual routine, making coffee, preparing for the day, eventually heading to the bathroom for her morning shower. But Brian was waiting, watching, preparing to execute the plan he'd been meticulously crafting in his mind. According to prosecutors who would later piece together the horrifying timeline, Brian waited until Miss Anne finished her shower. He waited until she was at her most vulnerable, naked, wet, completely unsuspecting that the man she'd married was about to become her executioner. And then he attacked. Brian struck Miss Anne with a rubber mallet, a heavy, brutal weapon designed to deliver devastating force. He hit her again, and again, and again. The blows rained down on her skull with such savage intensity that blood sprayed across the walls, across the ceiling, pooling beneath her as she collapsed. But the mallet alone didn't kill her fast enough. Miss Anne, despite the catastrophic injuries to her head, was still alive, still fighting. So Brian wrapped his hands around her neck and strangled her. He squeezed until her desperate gasps stopped, until her body went still, until the woman who had trusted him, who had opened her home and her heart to him, was finally, irrevocably dead. The autopsy would later reveal the full extent of Miss Anne's suffering. She had died from blunt force trauma to the head and manual strangulation. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. She had internal bleeding, spinal damage, and most tellingly, she had blood under her fingernails, Brian's blood. DNA evidence that proved Miss Anne had fought desperately, clawing at her attacker in a final, futile attempt to save her own life. After murdering his wife in cold blood, Brian didn't panic. He didn't break down. He didn't show an ounce of remorse or humanity. Instead, he did what any calculating killer would do. He cleaned up. He cleaned himself. He cleaned the murder weapon. He changed his clothes. And then, with the body of the woman he'd murdered still warm in the bedroom, he calmly leashed up the family dog and went for a walk. But this wasn't a normal walk. Surveillance cameras from around the neighborhood would later capture exactly where Brian went and what he did. The footage showed him walking directly to a drainage ditch near the house, a location he'd clearly chosen in advance. The cameras captured him disposing of items in the water before casually returning home. What Brian didn't know was that those cameras had just documented the single most damning piece of evidence against him. Less than 30 minutes after returning from his walk, Brian picked up his phone and dialed 911. And with a voice so calm, so eerily composed that it would later send chills down the spines of everyone who heard the recording, he reported what he claimed was his wife's tragic suicide. When Detective Thompson and Detective Smith arrived and began processing the scene, they immediately recognized that nothing about Brian's story made sense. He claimed suicide by gunshot, but there was no gun. No shell casings, no gunpowder residue. What they found instead was overwhelming evidence of a violent, prolonged attack. And Brian? He showed no grief, no shock, no emotion whatsoever. When officers pointed out fresh scratch marks on his arms, defensive wounds left by Miss Anne as she fought for her life, Brian claimed he hadn't even noticed them and couldn't explain how they'd gotten there. The detectives knew they were looking at a murderer. Now they just had to prove it. Subscribing gives a voice to women who can't speak anymore. If you won't do it, at least tell me why, because their silence is already loud enough. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, methodical, and absolutely devastating to Brian's web of lies. Detective Thompson and Detective Smith, along with a team of forensic experts, began systematically dismantling every aspect of Brian's story. The first breakthrough came from neighborhood surveillance footage. When investigators reviewed cameras from around Wake Forest Drive, they found exactly what they were looking for. The footage showed Brian's movements on the morning of November 24th with crystal clarity. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Brian could be seen leaving the house with the dog, walking directly to the drainage ditch, disposing of items in the water, and then returning home. Armed with this information, investigators searched the drainage ditch and made a critical discovery: the murder weapon, a rubber mallet covered in blood. They also recovered a cell phone that Brian had attempted to destroy, likely containing evidence he desperately wanted to hide. But the physical evidence was just the beginning. FBI cell phone data revealed that Brian's frequent business trips to Florida were actually visits to his married mistress. The data placed him in the same location as the other woman repeatedly over the course of months, completely destroying his claims of innocent business travel. Jessica Terrell confirmed what investigators suspected, that Miss Anne had discovered the affair after receiving the misdirected text message, and that she had planned to report the fraudulent marriage to immigration authorities. The autopsy provided the final pieces of the puzzle. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation confirmed that Miss Anne had died from blunt force trauma and manual strangulation. The injuries were consistent with being beaten with a heavy object like the rubber mallet found in the drainage ditch, and the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Brian's blood was under Miss Anne's fingernails, proving she had fought desperately against her attacker. Faced with this mountain of evidence, Brian did what manipulators and liars always do when cornered. He changed his story. Again and again and again. Brian's first alternative explanation was perhaps the most despicable. He suggested that Miss Anne's granddaughter Jessica and her boyfriend might have been responsible for the murder. This wasn't just deflection, it was a calculated attack on the very family members who were grieving Miss Anne's loss. But FBI cell phone location data quickly destroyed this lie. The data showed conclusively that both Jessica and her boyfriend were miles away from the house during the time frame when the murder occurred. They couldn't have been there. Brian knew they couldn't have been there. He was simply trying to shift blame to anyone but himself. When that story fell apart, Brian tried another angle. He suggested that Miss Anne might have been killed during a home invasion or burglary gone wrong. According to this version of events, unknown intruders had broken in, murdered Miss Anne for unclear reasons, and fled without taking anything of value. But this story was equally absurd. Investigators found no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. Nothing was stolen. And the security footage showed only 2 people present at the house during the relevant time frame: Miss Anne and Brian himself. There was no home invasion, no burglary, no mysterious intruders. There was only a husband who murdered his wife and then lied about it, over and over and over again. As each of Brian's stories was systematically disproven, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He continued insisting on his innocence, while simultaneously changing his account to try to explain away newly discovered evidence. This pattern convinced investigators that they were dealing not with a grieving widower, but with a cold-blooded killer who would say anything to avoid responsibility for his actions. On November 25, 2023, just 24 hours after the murder, Brian McManus was arrested and charged with malice murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The lies were transparent, and justice, though it would take time, was finally beginning to catch up with him. The trial of Brian McManus began on July 7, 2025. For 6 days, prosecutors presented a case so comprehensive, so damning, that there could be no doubt about what had happened in that bedroom on Wake Forest Drive. They presented DNA evidence showing Brian's blood under Miss Anne's fingernails. They showed security footage of Brian disposing of the murder weapon in the drainage ditch. They played the call where Brian's voice was eerily calm, devoid of any genuine emotion. They presented testimony from witnesses who described Brian's pattern of exploiting women, his fraudulent marriage, his secret affair, and his motive for murder. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, I'm honestly curious what's holding you back. Drop it in the comments. I actually want to know. Throughout the entire trial, Brian showed no emotion, no remorse, no humanity. Even when confronted with photographic evidence of the brutal injuries he'd inflicted on Miss Anne, even when faced with testimony from her devastated family members, he remained cold and detached. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of malice murder. On July 16, 2025, Brian McManus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Edward D. Lukemeyer didn't mince words during sentencing. "You basically bashed in the skull of another human being," the judge said, his voice heavy with disgust. Brian McManus would never walk free again. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, where he belongs. But the sentencing hearing wasn't just about Brian. It was about Miss Anne, and it was about the family he'd destroyed. Jessica Terrell, Miss Anne's beloved granddaughter, delivered a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. "I can't tell her how sorry I am," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "How selfish I feel for not eating Thanksgiving lunch with her the day before she was brutally beaten to death." Another granddaughter described Miss Anne as "my beautiful, kind, and loving Meemaw, who was ripped away from my family very brutally by a selfish, cold-blooded monster." The family's pain was compounded by Brian's attempts to blame them for the murder they were mourning. His accusations hadn't just been lies, they'd been another layer of cruelty inflicted on people who were already suffering unimaginable loss. District Attorney Eric Edwards, in his closing statement, called Brian exactly what he was: an evil sociopath who views the women in his life as disposable. Brian McManus was not only willing to exploit our immigration system and manipulate a vulnerable woman into a sham marriage, he was willing to kill her when she became inconvenient. The case of Lucille Anne McManus is a stark reminder of the vulnerability that comes with seeking connection in the digital age. Miss Anne did what millions of people do every single day. She took a chance on finding love through online dating. She trusted. She hoped. She believed in the possibility of happiness. And a predator exploited that trust, that hope, that belief, and turned it into a weapon. This case highlights the critical importance of recognizing red flags in relationships: the rushed timeline, the immediate push for marriage, the isolation from friends and family, the frequent unexplained absences. These are all warning signs that something isn't right, that the person you're dealing with may not have your best interests at heart. But perhaps the most important lesson from Miss Anne's story is this: older adults seeking companionship are particularly vulnerable to predators like Brian McManus. They may be lonely, they may be trusting, they may be hopeful in ways that make them easy targets for manipulation. This took me hours of painful research, reading autopsies, police files, and the cries of women that were ignored. If you felt safe watching from your screen, the least you can do is hit that red subscribe button. We need to look out for our loved ones. We need to ask questions. We need to pay attention when something doesn't feel right, because Miss Anne's murder was preventable. If someone had noticed the signs earlier, if someone had investigated Brian's background more thoroughly, if someone had intervened before it was too late, Lucille Anne McManus deserved to spend her golden years surrounded by the family she adored, watching her great-grandchildren grow, enjoying the simple pleasures of life in her beloved Warner Robins community. Instead, she became the victim of a predator who saw her only as a means to an end, a tool to be used and discarded when she was no longer useful. But we will remember Miss Anne not for how she died, but for how she lived, with love, with generosity, with a belief in human goodness that, while it made her vulnerable to evil, also made her beloved by everyone who knew her. She was the kind of person who made neighborhoods feel like home, who remembered birthdays and waved from her garden and made the world a little bit brighter just by existing in it. Brian McManus took her life, but he couldn't take her legacy. He couldn't erase the love she gave or the memories she created. And he couldn't prevent justice from finally catching up with him. Today, Brian McManus sits in a Georgia prison cell where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. He will never manipulate another woman. He will never exploit another trusting soul. He will never take another innocent life. And Miss Anne? She's finally at peace, reunited with the husband she lost years ago, watching over the family she loved more than anything in this world. If this case moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the importance of protecting the vulnerable people in our lives, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And subscribe to Cold Crime Cases so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest corners of human nature. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, your reactions, your own experiences with online dating or recognizing red flags in relationships. Your engagement keeps this channel alive and helps us continue bringing you the stories that need to be told. Rest in peace, Lucille Anne McManus. You deserved so much better than what Brian McManus gave you, but your story will live on. And maybe, just maybe, it will save someone else from a similar fate. This has been Cold Crime Cases. Stay safe out there. And remember, not everyone who swipes right has good intentions. Trust your instincts. Ask questions. Protect yourself and the people you love. Because predators like Brian McManus are out there, hiding behind charming smiles and carefully crafted lies, waiting for their next victim. Until next time.